So it's our pleasure today to welcome John Allen Gay to BYU. John is the executive director, of the John Quincy Adams Society, which is a nonpartisan national network of student groups focused on foreign policy. Previously, he was the managing editor of the National Interest magazine, and he is the co-author of a book entitled War with Iran, Political, Military, and Economic Consequences. The title of his address today is Early America's Underrated Foreign Policy Genius, John Quincy Adams. And so without further ado, turn the time and the podium over to John Allen Gay.
Thank you, everybody, and it's really great to be out here in Provo. I used to live in Colorado, and so I really like being out among the mountains again. It's a real improvement over DC. And so one of the things people always ask me when they hear that, this group is named after John Quincy Adams is, well, why are you named after a single-term president from 200 years ago? And I would say, well, for one, he's a pretty fascinating historical figure, eyewitness to the Battle of Bunker Hill. He's the first president of whom we have an original photograph that, we've actually tracked down. Hung out with the philosopher Jeremy Bentham while he was ambassador to Britain. Grew up overseas. You could argue he was America's first real diplo-brat. Learned half a dozen languages and had a very distinguished diplomatic career. He also obviously had a lot of involvement in domestic politics. He, at one point, refused a nomination to serve on the Supreme Court, served in Congress both before and after his presidency, and kept diaries that are still used quite heavily by historians today to understand that period. It was a meticulous record from when he was about 12 years old. But I think his real contribution that has relevance for us today is that he made great steps in aligning America's strongly held ideals, the desire that the good things that we have here, the relatively free system of government, a relatively prosperous economy, that these are things that we want to share with the world. But that's hard to do, and that sometimes, revolutions overseas that seem to be headed toward freedom actually lead to chaos. And sometimes we have to deal with difficult countries that don't share our values. And so in the course of laying out a measured vision of American power, he also laid out a way to align those ideals with those interests in a consistent way that I think we can still apply today. So let's zoom out for a moment and look really quickly at his career as a diplomat. He, of course, is the son of John and Abigail Adams, John Adams being the vice president and then president of the United States. And John Adams was also extensively involved in American diplomacy. And John Quincy accompanied him a great deal, would serve as a secretary to his father from a very young age, and actually went to the University of Leiden for a period in the Netherlands. He rose to prominence when he wrote a series of letters under the pseudonym Marcellus that were defending George Washington's policy, President George Washington's policy of neutrality between Great Britain and revolutionary France during some of the early wars between those two countries. And this was a very affecting conflict for many Americans. There were people who were sympathetic to both causes, those who felt that the French revolutionaries were kind of barbarians, anti-religious, anti-human, and there were others who felt that they were actually vindicating the true rights of man and that we should be backing them, that it was a continuation of our own American project happening now in Europe. And so his essay in defense of Washington's policy leads him into a string of ambassadorships. He starts in the Netherlands, goes to Prussia as well. He comes back, spends some time as a senator, then ends up in Russia, where he's there when Napoleon invades. He helps to negotiate the U.S. extraction from some of the Napoleonic aftershocks in the War of 1812, and then serves as the U.S. ambassador to the United Kingdom, and then becomes the Secretary of State under President Monroe. And during this period, the real contribution that he made was a speech that he gave on July the 4th in 1821 at the U.S. Capitol. And there was a custom that they had that they would have a distinguished guest come and read the Declaration of Independence and give a reflection on it to kind of revive the spirit of the young republic. And we'll go into some of the elements of that speech in a moment because it really lays out a lot of the core ideas of his foreign policy thought. He also was influential in writing the Monroe Doctrine, which really established a kind of separation between the old world, the kind of chaos that was going on in Europe at the time, and the new world where a lot of the colonies of Spain were beginning to throw off Spanish domination, and some of the more autocratic powers had not taken a liking to that, and there was talk that they might intervene. And so he had helped articulate a policy that established that distinction between the two spheres. Now, his presidency from a foreign policy perspective was less eventful, and he's thrown out by Andrew Jackson in a wave of populist anger, in case that sounds familiar to anybody. And then he goes back to Congress. He actually has a real second career as a central figure in opposing slavery. He was able to leverage his esteem as a former president of the United States to take a leading role that would have been too risky for many other politicians of the time in challenging, for example, the rules against debating slavery in Congress at the time. And so to understand some of the themes in his foreign policy thought, we need to look at the broad structure of the international system at the time that he was Secretary of State, shortly before he was Secretary of State and when he wrote the Marcellus Letters, and then leading up into his presidency. So first, Britain and France are really the main key players in shaping the character of the international system as the U.S. interacts with it. And the world is in many ways becoming polarized between them. France is a more ideological force, which again, some Americans have a lot of sympathy for, and then on the other side, there are a great number of Americans who are strongly sympathetic to Britain. The U.S. has deep relations with both states during this period. And so there's both an internal and an international aspect to this relationship. Next, the Spanish power in the New World is eroding quite rapidly. And this creates an opportunity on one side because the U.S. is able to expand into former Spanish territory, Florida being the most notable area that we acquired during this period. But also it's leading to rebellions in Spain's colonies that often speak the same language of the Declaration of Independence, of realizing sovereignty, overthrowing foreign domination. And so there's a lot of sympathy in the United States for this cause. And yet there's a real danger because if you start recognizing some of these revolutionary governments, the Spanish don't take too kindly to that and may actually go to war with us. And we're not in a terribly strong position at the time in many regards. You know, we are still a relatively weak new country that's still becoming united. And so there were several real themes that came to be in Adams's foreign policy thought in the period. First, a really strong sense of geopolitics, of the physical realities of the world as they shape the interaction of states. Next, he had what we might today call a sense of realism. And there were three real aspects to this that I want to focus on. A sense that states are driven basically by self-interest, a sense of the importance of strength as a shaping force, of relative power in determining the outcomes of international disputes, and a strong tendency to accept the world as it is, to treat that as the basic matter of foreign policy more than the world of ideas or of laws. And so at the same time, he had a great belief in the ideals for which America stood, and believed that America's example as a free society could actually really lead a lot of the world to have the chance to emulate us and realize what we had realized here. At the same time, he thought that our example was fragile, that we could tarnish it, that we could act incorrectly in pursuit of it, and that therefore we could actually weaken our example and make it less likely that our values would prevail. And finally, the underlying theme in a lot of his thought was a sense of humility, of a modesty about what we can accomplish, about our ability to discern what's going on in the world and set policies in accord with that. So first, the geopolitical aspect. He was the one who helped make America a continental nation. It was in his negotiations with the Spanish that we got a border on the Pacific coast, and it's also how we acquired Florida. And his policy had several central themes, at least as James Traub articulated in his biography of John Quincy Adams, that first, we would defend our own sovereignty and promote expansion into new territory, and that this ultimately would strengthen us as a country. It would allow us to grow our economic capacity, to grow our population, to really develop those underlying foundations of national power. And because that's so important, it was critical for America to avoid entanglement in some of these conflicts among the European powers, because they could hinder our project of expansion. And so it ultimately was a policy of strategic patience, of recognizing that America is on the rise, America is getting stronger, and that it can exploit its geopolitical position of a relative degree of separation from the powers of Europe in order to ultimately achieve a more favorable outcome. And so, for instance, in the 1793 Marcellus essay, he says, "As the citizens of a nation at a vast distance from the continent of Europe, of a nation whose happiness consists in a real independence, disconnected from all European interests and European politics, it is our duty to remain the peaceable and silent, though sorrowful spectators of the sanguinary scene." This is referring to some of these wars of revolution that are breaking out in Europe. And Traub also draws attention to a 1795 letter that Adams sent to his brother Charles about the same conflicts. He says, "Every hour of neutrality now has a tendency to extricate us from both of these shameful dependencies and to make us a really and completely independent people." The two dependencies he's referring to are our commercial dependence on Britain and our kind of political dependence on our relationship with France. So next, he has these realist assumptions, the self-interested state. He had constant worries that the U.S. would be turned into a pawn by one of the world's other powers and kind of sacrificed to serve their interests, even when these powers might be aligned with us on an ideological basis. So he had witnessed the case of Citizen Genet, and again in Traub's biography, he really plays up the importance of this, informing Adams's thoughts. Citizen Genet was a French diplomat who came on a mission to the United States, and rather than going to Washington, or rather going to Philadelphia and presenting himself to President George Washington, he went to Charleston and began raising privateers to conduct France's war against Great Britain. And this, for Adams, was a lesson that even these friendly states would ultimately serve their own interests in hours of crisis. And on the flip side of that, he was willing to let the U.S. follow its own interest. Throughout the Marcellus letter, he points out that neutrality could actually have economic benefits to the United States because the increase in demand among the warring parties would actually lead them to trade with us more. And this is actually something that's been borne out by contemporary scholarship. Eugene Goltz and Darrell Press have written an article called "The Effects of War on Neutral Countries," which lays out how trade with Europe during the opening years of World War I by the United States actually increased, which is more or less the opposite of what one would expect. We think, oh, international chaos, that's going to be really bad for the economy. And actually, it was much more complicated than that. I'd urge you to read that paper. It's not a cut and dry case, but it was very much reflective of what Adams had intuited. Next, strength matters in foreign policy. There is a long series of actions over the course of the U.S. negotiations with Spain over the status of Florida, over the status of Texas, and ultimately over that Pacific border. And so the U.S. had actually seized Spanish territory. It's an island off the coast of Florida and Georgia called Amelia Island, which now is a big tourist resort, but back then it was a Spanish possession still. And it had been taken over by pirates, and rather than giving it back to the Spanish after we had reconquered it, we just hung on to it. And Traub suggests in his biography that this was a way of signaling America's improving position to the Spanish, that we were showing off our strength, showing, look, we have the advantage here. You're going to have to make us some serious concessions to us rather than taking a hard line. And a similar pattern was followed in Andrew Jackson's expedition in Florida. It started out as a punitive expedition against some Seminole tribes that had been conducting raids in the area, and it ended up with Jackson vastly exceeding his orders and going and actually seizing the Spanish garrison at modern-day Pensacola. And almost everybody in the cabinet was strongly opposed to Jackson's actions, except JQA, who used them as leverage, further leverage, in his negotiations with the Spanish. And again, those negotiations would prove extremely successful. On the flip side, he was willing to recognize weakness when that created necessities for the United States in its conduct of foreign policy. So going back to 1793, to the Marcellus letter, he says to those who would have us intervene with France against Britain, he says, well, you know, they probably learned their lesson in the Revolutionary War. They're not going to invade us again. But we have a sea coast of 1,200 miles everywhere open to invasion. And where is the power to protect it? We have a flourishing commerce expanding to every part of the globe. And where will it turn when excluded from every market of the earth? He concludes by saying to advise us to engage voluntarily in the war is to aim a dagger at the heart of the country. So he was willing to say, hey, America is not in the position to actually achieve the outcomes that maybe ideologically we'd be more sympathetic to. And finally, that ties into his willingness to accept the world as it is. So we see this in the Monroe Doctrine in regards to its treatment of the Latin American republics as they're declaring independence. There's a great book on this by Michaelis Fabri of Georgia Tech on the general challenge of when do you choose to recognize a state. And in Adams's view, it's really driven by when those states actually begin to act like states, begin to achieve full control of their territories, prove that they're able to defy those who would take their independence away from them. So in Monroe's speech, which Adams was very central in writing, he says that it's our policy to consider the government de facto as the legitimate government for us. And he makes reference to governments that have declared their independence and maintain it. And he says that if we look to the comparative strength and resources of Spain and these new governments, and their distance from each other, it must be obvious that she can never subdue them. And so this was not an ideologically driven policy of recognizing these states the moment they declared independence before they could actually exert control over their territory. But at the same time, it wasn't a policy that pretended that these distant rulers were still really in charge. And there were actually echoes of this, again, in his handling of the Amelia Island affair, in the seizure of Florida, and actually in his defense of seizing Oregon from the British in 1845 or so. It's a doctrine, he uses the word actual possession, that countries that have control of something, that needs to be the basis of our policy, as opposed to necessarily where the treaties and the laws may point us. In spite of all of these realist assumptions, he also had a very deep belief in our ideals. And I'll read you a quote about the Declaration of Independence from his 1821 speech. I think will give you a sense of just how revolutionary he thought our project was in the world. He says that the Declaration was the first solemn declaration by a nation of the only legitimate foundation of civil government. It was the cornerstone of a new fabric destined to cover the surface of the globe. It demolished at a stroke the lawfulness of all governments founded upon conquest. It swept away all the rubbish of accumulated centuries of servitude. It announced in practical form to the world the transcendent truth of the unalienable sovereignty of the people. So there was no real sense that, oh, you know, we should be a little bit relativistic about this, and maybe other countries have their own way of doing things. You know, no, he believed ultimately that a republic was the best form of government that most respected the fundamental dignity of humanity. And yet, he recognized at the same time that this example that we were providing to the world of a republic was an example that could be extinguished or tarnished, and that the fast road to that would be overextension, if we began to slip into a pattern of domination by trying to advance our ideals, that we would ultimately make that example less credible and something that people wouldn't desire to emulate. And so accordingly, he counseled a kind of middle path between indifferentism or relativism and a policy of intervention to actually support some of these republics and other movements that are sympathetic to our values. So the real line that everybody remembers, the section everybody remembers from his 1821 speech, he says, "Wherever the standard of freedom and independence has been or shall be unfurled, there will her heart, America's heart, her benedictions and her prayers be. But she goes not abroad in search of monsters to destroy. She is the well-wisher to the freedom and independence of all. She is the champion and vindicator only of her own. She will recommend the general cause by the countenance of her voice and the benignant sympathy of her example. She well knows that by once enlisting under banners other than her own, were they even the banners of foreign independence, she would involve herself, beyond the power of extrication, in all wars of interest and intrigue, of individual avarice, envy, and ambition, which assume the colors and usurp the standard of freedom. The fundamental maxims of her policy would insensibly change from liberty to force. The frontlet upon her brows would no longer beam with the ineffable splendor of freedom and independence, but instead would soon be substituted an imperial diadem, flashing in false and tarnished luster the murky radiance of dominion and power. She might become the dictatress of the world. She would no longer be the ruler of her own spirit." So again, there's this very strong sense that there is a danger in these projects to actively seek to extend our values, that because of this underlying tendency that all states have to serve their own interests, that we could actually come to kind of corrupt our project and become the sort of country that we had rebelled against when we left the British Empire. And I think a key theme in here that's tied to this assumption about self-interest is this line about usurping the standard of freedom. So he's referring to actors that come to America, seek to use its power to serve their ends, but do so by speaking the language of our values, even though their motives may be more complicated or may be more selfish. And in many cases in recent history, many of these actors have proven much more effective at getting things done in Washington than they have actually back at home. So with the run-up to the war in Iraq, we saw several examples of this. Ahmed Chalabi of the Iraqi National Congress, a dissident group dedicated to replacing the government of Saddam Hussein. He had assured the U.S. that Iraqis would welcome us as liberators, that sectarianism was not a central and important feature in Iraqi politics, and he also fed us lots of intelligence about all the weapons of mass destruction that Saddam had. When we went in there, when didn't find those WMDs and did find that some of the assessments of Iraqi politics he gave were a little bit on the optimistic side, he said, "We are heroes in error, As far as we are concerned, we've been entirely successful. That tyrant Saddam is gone, and the Americans are in Baghdad. What was said before is not important. And ultimately, a man that had been branded the George Washington of Iraq by a number of his promoters in Washington turned out to not really have much political support inside actual Iraq, and he had been in exile for many years. And he was even accused at one point of passing secrets to the Iranians, who were our real competitors in establishing stability in Iraq. And on the other side of the Iraq decision was a more personal set of motives. We find this in the case of Curveball, a source that German intelligence had, an Iraqi exile, who fed us a lot of information about Iraqi bioweapons programs. It was actually crucial in the presentation that Colin Powell gave to the UN Security Council. And when we went to those locations that he had said were home to bioweapons labs, we didn't find anything. One of the places was actually a seed processing facility. And it turned out, when people dug into his background some more, that the reason he left Iraq may have actually been some business disputes that he had had, rather than political persecution. And one of the CIA analysts that was charged with processing his information said, look, it may simply be that he just wanted to get residency in Germany and felt that telling German intelligence lots of fancy things about Iraq that the German intelligence service was really interested in would make that more likely. And there's all sorts of examples of this kind of pattern from all over the world. It can be done by allies, it can be done by enemies, it can be done by sub-state groups or individual actors, as we see with Curveball. But it's a persistent pattern, and it's become even stronger from Adams's day and from Washington's day to today, since we are stronger. And if you can get us on your side, you're much more likely to achieve your own ends in your own country. And tied up in all that is a very similar fear in Adams's thought, which is of a general attachment to particular states and the possibility that we could delude ourselves because of our attachment to particular states. So in the Marcellus letter, he makes a reference to a pattern in which we throw a veil over the errors and crimes of another state. He's referring to France in this case, which, during the Revolutionary period had a lot of internal political violence. And we see a close echo of this in George Washington's farewell address in 1796. He says, excessive partiality for one foreign nation and excessive dislike of another cause those whom they actuate to see danger only on one side and serve to veil and even second the arts or influence on the other. So in the cases when we are falling for this, we are really disobeying Adams's warning. But I think at some level, we can't fault the other side for trying to deceive us. They're serving their own interests. But what's happening is really coming from within, as far as Adams sees it, that we want to be conned. We want to believe that for every bad guy, there's a good guy, and that we can readily read and shape the arc of history in our foreign policy. And that takes us to the final core theme in Adams's thought, which is humility. And again, it's not rooted in a lack of confidence about what we stand for, but in an honest appraisal of both our ability to actually carry out our ends and, due to our own fallibility, the potential that we may be drawn away from our own ends and towards self-interest rather than the service of our ideals, and thereby achieve results that aren't actually for the good of those who we intend to help. Walter McDougall, in his book, The Tragedy of U.S. Foreign Policy, suggests that the founders were shaped by what he called a residual Christian anthropology, a concept of original sin, that human nature had kind of natural desires that ultimately were not very healthy, greed, selfishness. Klaus Rinn of Catholic University of America, he was giving a talk just last week that I was at, and he talked about a shift in the view of mankind from the period of the founders, where there was a belief that from the crooked timber of humanity no straight thing is ever made, that man has all these negative impulses, to quote JQA, avarice, envy, ambition, and that therefore governance ultimately needs to be based on restraints of individuals, It needs to have checks and balances that limit some of those ambitions or even turn ambitions against one another, and that ultimately allow time, by slowing things down, to cool the passions of the moment. And the new view, as Rin sees it, turns away from humility, and it centers instead on man's great capacity to overcome his flaws and kind of make himself righteous. And in this view, why would we restrain righteous action? Why would we restrain ourselves if we know we're acting virtuously, if we can be so confident that we've kind of purified our own nature? Restraint, in this view, becomes a kind of cowardice or weakness or even irresponsibility. And the proponents of this new view are actually pretty widespread within the kind of foreign policy class within Washington. So, for instance, we see this tendency to give America kind of almost superhuman abilities in the international system. Madeleine Albright, the Secretary of State in 1998, said in regards to a dispute with Iraq, "If we have to use force, it's because we're America. We're the indispensable nation. We stand tall and we see further than other countries into the future, and we see the danger here to all of us." And, and that wasn't just on her side of the aisle. On the other side, George W. Bush speechwriter David Frum and the intellectual Richard Pearl wrote a book that promised almost eschatological results for American foreign policy. They called it An End to Evil, and said that we could achieve that by a global campaign against a long list of enemies. And I think it's fair to say that this issue of humility was sorely lacking in the kind of run-up to Iraq. It's consistent with a lack of humility, for example, to go over the objections of our allies, ignore warnings from experts on Iraqi politics, to use ambiguous evidence, and ultimately, as people like Adams would have predicted, we failed to achieve the righteous outcomes that we predicted. We had set out in an enterprise to achieve security, to realize the fundamental human dignity of the Iraqi people. And yet, we ended up getting international instability, more than 100,000 violent deaths in Iraq, and the displacement of about 2/3 of the Christian population in Iraq. Our good intentions weren't sufficient to yield good results. And Adams wouldn't have been surprised at all. He recognized that the American project and that American policymakers themselves are corruptible, that our policy can fail from within. Corruptible in the sense of our nature, not in the sense, of finance necessarily. That we have this tendency to misread, to make self-serving interpretations or interpretations that feed our preconceived notions, and that this can be extremely dangerous. Ultimately, we can lead ourselves into temptation, temptation that stems from our good goals, our good ideals, taken out of balance with reality. And ultimately, as Adams saw it, the road that this temptation led on was a road to empire. So in the 1821 speech, he has this line, he says about America, "Nor even is her purpose the glory of Roman ambition, nor to regere imperio populosa, her memento to her sons." Now, the Latin bit there is a line from the Aeneid. And in the Dryden translation, I'll pull it out for you so that you can see what it is that Adams is rejecting. It says, "But Rome, 'tis thine alone with awful sway to rule mankind and make the world obey, disposing peace and war by thy own majestic way, to tame the proud, the fettered slave to free. These are imperial arts and worthy thee." Now, we're not a true empire, but there are echoes in some of the ambitions to the view that we see here in the Aeneid that Adams was rejecting. Our foreign policy seeks to establish a position of primacy around the world, and we ultimately see this as something that will dispose peace and war, that we can suppress conflicts and reduce security dilemmas by supporting states that would otherwise be in conflict with one another. And we think we can bring rogue nations and dictators to heel. But for people of the founding generation, including Adams, avoiding the fate of Rome was a central theme of the founding. And so, accordingly, the alternative vision that Adams laid out was not one of empire. He said, right after the line about the Roman ambition, he says, "Her glory is not dominion, but liberty. Her march is the march of the mind. She has a spear and a shield, but the motto upon her shield is freedom, independence, peace. This has been her declaration. This has been, as far as her necessary intercourse with the rest of mankind would permit, her practice. And so the themes that we would bring from an Adams-like foreign policy into the present that are applicable, again, realism, a sense that power matters, but that we also have to accept the world as it is. A desire to not get too attached to other actors in the international system, whether they're movements, individuals, or states. A sense of geopolitics. In his day, it was one of continental expansion. In our day, it may be a strategy of restraint in which we take advantage of the oceans that we have that are separate us from all of the world's powers and that are defended by the world's strongest navy. It would also include humility, a recognition of the limits on our power, and that our motives can be led away from purity. And finally, for achieving broader moral ends, that we should not lean on force, but on the power of our example, and that the reverse, that leaning on force, corrupts us, dismays observers, and makes those who would emulate us potentially lose their faith in what we stand for. And so this sort of policy enabled truly great success and prosperity in Adams's day. The U.S. went from being that colonial backwater that had to fear involvement even by fading Spain to becoming the world's largest economy in the space of about a century. And the roots of this policy that Adams articulated, this broader framework, this approach, are not in the contingencies of an era, but in more timeless things, in broader insights about human nature and the nature of politics and of the international system. And that's why I think it's reasonable that we might work to revive the thought of John Quincy Adams in our foreign policy. Thank you.
So we have a little time for questions. For the benefit of our listening audience, we ask you to come to the microphone over here, and that if you're a BYU student, you tell us your name and what you're studying. So please come and join the conversation.
Hi, my name is Spencer Acey. I am a BYU student. I am studying nutritional science. And you spoke of several themes present in JQA's foreign policy that ought to be applied in our day today. So which of those particular themes do you think that if applied correctly would be most efficacious in improving our foreign policy?
Well, I think, again, the not going abroad in search of monsters to destroy, that seeing our values as not something that we can impose. Because I think we are often tempted to use military force ultimately as a means for achieving kind of humanitarian and political ends. And the recent record of that has been pretty limited. I mentioned Iraq, but the case of Libya is also pretty similar. You know, we had, I think, a noble purpose in going in, but actually the result ended up being chaos. And so I think a more measured account of our ability to actually make the world adapt our values would be a real step forward for our foreign policy.
So then the humility theme then is that?
Yeah, and the
appraisal of what we're able to do and not do.
And the faith in the power of our example, that freedom is ultimately something people have to realize for themselves.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
My name is Tom Gasaway. I'm a BYU student studying international relations. I had a question about one of the things that John Quincy Adams said in his speech, which you quoted. He said, "She might become the dictatress of the world. She would be no longer the ruler of her own spirit." So my question is, over the last, since World War II, the United States has been the leader of the Western world to varying degrees over the decades. My question is, has the U.S. ever fudged that line and come close to becoming that dictatress? And how has that impacted her ability to rule her own spirit?
Well, you know, I think it's fair to say that our ambitions, you know, in seeking to achieve kind of political ends within countries through our foreign policy have often led us astray. The case of Russia is one example. Our approach to security in Eastern Europe, to expand NATO right into their neighborhood, I think contributed a lot to their distrust of us and ultimately led to a more difficult security situation for us in Eastern Europe. Most of the Russia or NATO experts you talk to speak of, for instance, the Baltic states as a liability for us rather than an asset. But our decision to expand that alliance was ultimately a product of our ambition to ultimately be a kind of leader of a Europe whole, free, and at peace, which is kind of the underlying vision that we speak of with NATO. And within Russian politics, we also had supported Boris Yeltsin's government against some of its opponents. And Yeltsin, I think, was a good example of someone who was good at talking to Washington, but who was not necessarily as popular at home as he was here. And, the economic chaos of that period is something that's a lot more salient to many Russians than the opening of the political system or the removal of communism. And our involvement in that actually, I think, really did tarnish our image in their eyes. And so when you combine those two aspects of our approach, I think it contributed somewhat to the friction that we have over there.
And just as a follow-up, is there a way to actually tell when it's actually self-interest, which is justifiable, or whether it's leaning more to this dictatorous spirit, which leads to issues like you were mentioning?
Well, I think, the view of humility and the way that Adams described people thinking about politics when they have a strong feeling is one in which that kind of self-interest is inseparable. And yet, I do think that what he would have counseled, he felt that states had a basic duty toward one another of neutrality. And this is also something that we see in Washington. And that's not really our default position anymore. David Hendrickson of Colorado College has done some great scholarship on how we've shifted toward a notion of collective security in which, rather than seeing neutrality toward other conflicts as a way of preventing conflict from spreading by keeping other countries from getting involved, that we see strong guarantees by countries to one another that they will enter conflicts on their behalf as a way to make conflict unlikely. And I think that ultimately that fundamental shift really does show both the expansion of our self-understanding of our concept of our interests, and I think that a narrower concept of our interests and a return to a sense of neutrality as something that is good rather than something that is irresponsible would be some ways to kind of lead us away from the more dictatorous model towards something that's more measured.
Thank you.
Sure.
My name is Michael Benson. I'm also an international relations major here at BYU as well. So you talk about in your talk about how John Quincy Adams, he was more of a realist, but he wanted to spread American ideology. So I guess my question is more of, did John Quincy Adams ever make any tangible steps towards trying to push our ideology on other countries, or was he more concerned with just being that example that you talked about for freedom?
Well, again, his focus really was on the example. There was some diplomacy that was conducted with Latin America during his presidency that moved a little bit more in that shaping direction. But ultimately, again, deriving from this notion that states have a duty of neutrality toward one another, he would have seen that imposition as generally being incompatible with that. And again, he also had a strong focus on the potential drawbacks of a policy of actively spreading our ideology. He wanted it to spread, but he didn't think that actively trying to spread it was the right way to do that, and actually thought it would make it less likely to succeed.
Yeah, so like being that example is more powerful than trying to push that ideology on other countries.
Precisely, yeah.
Awesome, thank you.
My name is Adam Stevenson. I'm an international relations major here, and I guess I just have a question just in relation to what you discussed about Adams' quote about America becoming the dictatress of the world. And when America, like today, encounters like a hostile nation, what is kind of like using the Adams philosophy, what is like the best way to deal with like kind of a hostile or rogue nation like North Korea or even Russia?
Well, I think if they're hostile to us, I think that that's one thing. You know, if it's a country that, for instance, is using force against the United States, you know, Adams was a jealous defender of American sovereignty, and anybody that attacks us, I think he pretty reasonably would have wanted us to respond in some way, and that's consistent with his use of force throughout the dispute with Spain, for example. I'm sorry, what was the second part of your question?
Yeah, I mean, basically, I mean, you're pretty much answering it already, but just kind of if a country is hostile towards us, maybe not militarily, I guess what comes to mind is kind of the interference in our election that, you know, a lot of the intelligence community agrees upon. What it would be kind of using this philosophy would be like the best response, I don't know, to something like that.
Well, I think on the political interference, again, that's something that he would have been highly sensitive to. I think in this case, we would also want to step back and realize, you know, hey, we are actively trying to spread our system of government. We have entire institutions in Washington that are dedicated to that. The National Endowment for Democracy, for example, you know, which is essentially dedicated to political change, driving political change in other countries. And even if we are right in doing that, even if they're totally wrong, we're totally right, you know, we're really pushing against the bad guys' perceptions of that do matter. And they may perceive it like, hey, they're interfering in our politics. That's a gross violation of our sovereignty. We're going to violate their sovereignty and interfere in their politics right back. And I feel like that's not a dynamic that we're sensitive to anymore. And it's almost like politically incorrect to mention that, like, hey, other countries might not like it when we do this, or even just subgroups within those countries might not like it and may find it highly threatening, just as we do. You know, I think a lot of people are justifiably very angry about the apparent Russian interference in the election. And I think we ought to think like, hey, those other countries get those feelings too.
Right. Thank you.
Sure.
Hi, my name is Brigham Larson, and I'm a BYU student studying manufacturing engineering. And I had just a simple question for you about how the average American can make a difference in U.S. policy and foreign affairs, because I feel like we're all kind of trapped as spectators or as audience members, especially in college. We can't make a huge difference. And I was wondering if you had any advice on things that we could do to get involved.
Well, I mean, ultimately, foreign policy is kind of it's unlike a lot of domestic issues. The drivers are much narrower. It's much more confined to Washington, to the ability to lobby, to who has what position in the State Department. There's a lot less accountability at elections for it. Unless somebody really messes things up, it's usually not going to be a decisive issue. I think it was something like 1 in 20 voters in the last election said foreign policy was the most important issue for them. So I would say the best way to do that is to get involved in that process yourself. I mean, not to plug the JQA Society, but that is something we do. We want to train the next generation of policymakers and, you know, kind of show them, hey, there are alternatives possible to the last 30 years or so where we've really had a lot of really high ambitions and really limited success, and to then help people get careers. So that's something we do. But in general, you know, I think getting involved directly in the process is what people need to do.
Thank you.
Last question.
My name is Marissa Gerber, and I am a student at BYU, and I'm studying international relations. And this is kind of along the lines with the entire aspect of how important humility was to JQA. But how is the impact of American exceptionalism on the world stage changing, considering the rise of all the nationalistic tendencies across the globe? Like, how do you think he would have reacted to that? Because I know he didn't support the view of exceptionalism, yet he did at the same time because he did believe in those American values. How do you think he would react to the situations we see here where the nationalistic tendencies are also rising that aren't just American?
Well, I think it's a more measured concept of exceptionalism is the key. It's an exceptionalism within bounds, and it's an exceptionalism that says, yeah, we're great. If you'd like to emulate us, that's great. Maybe we'll even help you. But it's not one that says, you know, we're so great we get to decide that you get to be like us. And I think nationalism is actually a natural response when people come into other countries and tell them how things are going to be. You know, again, it's happened here with our election, with the strong resentment against Russia that was provoked by their involvement in our own politics. And that's a pattern that applies almost everywhere. You know, Iran, for example, which is, you know, the country I follow most closely, is an intensely nationalistic country. And that's even beyond people. It's not just people who support the regime that feel that way. People who are opposed to the regime are often very adamantly opposed to outside powers being involved in Iranian politics. They're very resistant to foreign economic involvement in their country. You know, that's not always a healthy tendency by any means, but it's a reality of the international system, of states, of state interaction that we have to take into account in our policies, and I think we don't really do a very good job of that.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
All right, please join me in thanking John Allen Gay for a very interesting and stimulating discussion.
Thank you.